Good morning and welcome to the Killik & Co market update. This week we've learned that inflation in the UK for November came in at 3.1%, so that's 1.1% above the Bank of England's target rate of 2%, and that means that the Bank of England's Governor Mark Carney will have to write a letter to the Chancellor to explain what he's going to do to get inflation back closer to target. The rule is that a public letter has to be written if inflation goes above 3% or below 1%, and last time one had to be written was back in December 2016 when inflation was at 0.9%. So as I said, for November the rate was at 3.1%, and the reason it's so high is mainly thought to be due to rising food prices, particularly butter, chocolate and fish. It's definitely bad news for the UK consumer to have rising food prices in the run-up to Christmas, particularly as wage inflation in the UK is still relatively low at 2.2%. And over in the US, we've had the third rate rise of 2017, taking the US interest rate to 1.5%. We did also have a press release and a conference from Janet Yellen, and this was her last speech as the chair of the Federal Reserve. She did say in the speech that she still expects to see a further 3 rate rises for 2018, but as I said, it's her last conference as the chair, and we'll have to wait to see what Jerome Powell does when he takes over her job in early 2018. Within her press conference, Janet Yellen did make some comments about Donald Trump's proposed tax reform, and in my view she did put a bit of a dampener on this. So I'm just going to read you this quote here from her speech. She said that while changes in tax policy will likely provide some lift to economic activity in coming years, the magnitude and timing of the macroeconomic effects of any tax package remain uncertain. So that shows that perhaps she thinks that the economic improvements that will come about because of the tax reform will not perhaps be quite as high as what Donald Trump is hoping for. And also in the US yesterday, we've had a very significant vote on something called net neutrality. So this net neutrality concept is based on the Communications Act of 1934, and it basically states that all internet traffic must be treated equally by internet service providers. So at the moment in the US, the main internet service providers are Verizon, Comcast and AT&T. And just to put that into context, the equivalent over here in the UK is BT. So at the moment, now that we have the net neutrality rule in place in the US, internet service providers must treat all traffic equally. So if you've got one person watching a video on Netflix, someone else online shopping and someone else checking their emails, all of those types of internet traffic must be treated the same, and no one type of traffic can be prioritized over another. However, now that the net neutrality rule has been overturned by the Federal Communications Committee, that means that internet service providers can now charge companies to allow their traffic to be prioritized over and above that traffic of other companies. So that's potentially good news for these internet service providers because they will be able to charge companies for a service they weren't charging for before. However, it could potentially be bad news for companies like Netflix, who may now have to pay more because they do use a lot of the bandwidth of the internet. However, I think the main companies to lose out from this will be the smaller startup companies who won't be able to afford to pay the internet service providers to have faster traffic. So they therefore are likely to get a worse service. So early days, the vote was just last night, but it will be very interesting to see how this pans out. So this is our last podcast for 2017, so thank you very much for listening. We hope you have a really good Christmas and New Year, and we'll look forward to seeing you again in January.